After months of anticipation and 2 weeks of wrangling, there was still no treaty at the end of Copenhagen's Climate Change Summit. There was a final agreement in the shape of an accord, but this isn't legally binding. Some nations say they only recognise the accord's existence and not its content. 192 member countries attended the UN-run meeting. Its aim to take the next step beyond the Kyoto Protocol in the battle against climate change. At Copenhagen, it was China that clashed with the majority of opinion. She vetoed a proposal for a 50% reduction in global carbon emissions over the next 40 years. China also halted a proposed 80% cut in CO2 by developed nations. Copenhagen's delegates did manage to agree by how much they should limit global warming, an increase of no more than 2 degrees Celsius by 2050. Scientists say it's the very minimum required to stop the worst effects of climate change. And each nation is now meant to submit plans to reduce their emissions by the end of this month. The richest nations also agreed to come up with $30 billion in the next 3 years. That's to help poorer countries not only reduce their emissions, but also cope with the current effects of global warming. A further commitment of $100 billion a year was promised by 2020. But there had been high hopes that more would have been achieved, namely an actual legally binding treaty. Many poorer countries already affected by rising sea levels say it's an outrage. They're blaming the big players, including the US, India, Brazil, China and South Africa, for holding back. Meanwhile, President Obama and the UK Foreign Minister David Miliband are pointing the finger at China for hindering attempts to monitor future carbon emissions.
We must have a mechanism to review whether we are keeping our commitments and exchange this information in a transparent manner. These measures need not be intrusive or infringe upon sovereignty. They must, however, ensure that an accord is credible and that we're living up to our mutual obligations. Without such accountability, any agreement would be empty words on a page.
But as nations argue over how and where to apportion blame for failures at Copenhagen, the critical problem remains of how to cut CO2 emissions and stop climate change in its tracks.